Hello, everybody. James here in its franchise university with Shane Douglas himself. There he is, the eponymous Shane Douglas. We're going to be talking, I do the plugs on various other shows, I know, but this has no advertising, no plugs. And we're just going to get straight into it. And one more thing very quickly is that we still haven't fixed the microphone on Shane's setup. We will get that sorted for the next episode. Please, let's hope we do. So, trust me, it's not Shane's fault or anyone's fault. It's just a technical disappointment after technical disappointment, hardware, software, the whole thing. But for this episode, we're going to be talking about Halloween Havoc 1989, the very, very first episode iteration of Halloween Havoc ever. So it was a WCW concept, and it didn't seem that much different to any other pay-per-view except for a bit of extra dressing, quite frankly, that we'll be talking about later on. But, Shane, I want to give you some news from around this period, so are you ready to hear it?
Yes, please.
Okay, WCW news around this time, and I really hope you've got something to say about this because I've written quite a bit about it. There is potential return of Arn Anderson and Tully Blanchard after quickly dropping the WWF tag titles to Demolition to Turner. It is scuppered because after it's already revealed that they have left the WWF, or at least thinking about leaving the WWF, Tully is scheduled and then fails a drug test. So do you know the story about all this, or do I need to carry on?
You can keep carrying on. I do remember hearing it, but the particulars, that's a million years ago.
Yeah. So I was speaking with Tully last month, I think. The interview came out, and he said that he had $250,000 a year contract on the table with Turner, and then it got yanked when they found out that the drug test failure had come up. So essentially, he couldn't go to WCW, couldn't go to WWF, and then shortly after that, he decides to retire. Yeah. So I know from talking with Tully that he's still not over that one.
Yeah, I bet. I remember at the time hearing they were coming back, and there was a bit of excitement because they had just, I've been around them and always was talking to Arn. And so there was a bit of excitement about it, like a buzz, that they were returning. And then that hit. But at that time, though, as I recall, sitting in the dressing room and hearing this, there were always so many rumors that were floating around that you were, pre-internet, we weren't sure, okay, is somebody making this up? Is this to throw the fans off the scent so they get more surprised when they do pop up? And then, right, he said when he announced retirement, because he was fairly young to have retired at the time that he did. And, was really in the crux part of his career. And at the time, I remember thinking to myself, oh, yeah, he'll stay retired, right? He'll be back in 6 months or whatever. And bless his heart, he really stuck to that. He would dabble into and out of the business here and there after that. But, by and large, Tully had been the one person that retired from wrestling that sort of stayed retired from wrestling, right?
Yeah, well, do you know, funny, we mentioned Killer Khan last week, and he genuinely did. He never wrestled another match. He made his money and left. Yep. A theory going around at the time, and tell me if you heard this at the time, was that Tully was trying to influence WWF wrestlers to jump to the NWA. And that, I don't know how conspiratorial this is getting, but this is maybe why Vince maybe scheduled a drug test. He fails, and then to screw him over. I don't know how conspiratorial that is or how truthful that is, but is there anything you may have heard?
I don't remember hearing that, but again, at this time, the drug testing stuff came up in WCW later than it did in WWF. So I'm not sure. I'm sure they would have the testing at that time, but to think that Vince would have done that, throw that off, because you could very easily see where they would. If you were WCW, you could say, "Hey, Tully, we know you're going to piss dirty. Come back in 2 weeks, or whatever." So my guess is that it's just probably more conspiracy theory. And to be honest with you, at the time, Vince, I'm sure, was giving it more attention than he was letting on to us. But in those conversations, like I mentioned in the last week's episode, how much I didn't talk to Kevin Dunn about things. Vince, there was one time I wanted to do one of the vignettes, and I wanted somebody, one of the grips, to make some noise in the back periodically. And this is after Hogan had just gone to WCW. And he did a promo one time where he talked about he had all the Irishmen, the O'Learys, the O'Malleys, and yes, even the McMahons quaking in their boots. And I wanted to fire back and say something like finally, like after several times of making noise saying, Mr. Bully, will you sit down and take your seat? Maybe you'll finally learn something about this business. And Vince said to me, no. Said, I love it, it's great, but we don't do that here. Never talk about the enemy. And so, like the fact that I would think that Vince was spending portions of his day going, okay, what's going on in WCW and how can we derail that? I mean, let's be honest, he was pretty much beating, once he took over, he's beating them pretty handily. So I don't think he gave it much notion. It seems to me in my recollection that WCW is more always playing catch up to Vince than Vince would have been thinking about them.
Now, the state of the company in late 1989 is said to be one of frustration and unhappiness, with injuries and a raft of bad weather contributing to no-shows. To make things worse, Hurricane Hugo gets some events cancelled, and even crazier, there's a very famous earthquake that hit California that ended up causing baseball's World Series Game 4 to be postponed and ended up running, when it was rescheduled, running against Halloween Havoc. So that may have... apparently it did quite well on the buy rates, though, so having said that. Also, Jim Herd is coming up to his first year as Executive Vice President of WCW and making most people's lives miserable. Venue attendance has tanked, viewership ratings have lowered a bit. Who was the person you would ask to speak to if you wanted questions about your directions or matches at this time? So basically, who was like in charge of you, or who would be your liaison to the office at this point?
Well, again, it depended on where you were standing. If you were at the building, out, like say they're running Dallas. If you were in Dallas, it would be somebody in the building. I would later find out that Jim Herd was quote unquote ultimately the final arbiter of things, and that the infamous story of me having my final discussion with Jim as condescendingly as he possibly could have put that talk. Turned out that he wasn't quite aware of what he was looking at. So Jim was brought in. My understanding at the time was because he had been successful at Pizza Hut. And, I say this all the time. It's not like wrestling is some monolith that's impossible for anybody to crack and figure out if you haven't been in it. Obviously, you're going to know much better if you have been in it and been successful in it. It's really, it plays in between all the genres. It's a genre unto itself. It's not really acting, although acting does come into it. It's not really sport, although athleticism does come into it. It parlays itself someplace in between, all of those entities. And so it's never really 1 foot this or 1 foot that. And the same thing with business. I'm sure Jim Herd, as a CEO of a company, probably knew where to turn the buttons and which nails to hit. But it doesn't mean that you're going to have any clue of how to launch and create a character. I always talk about the nuances, right? The nuanceical stuff. That's the stuff that's damn difficult to pick up. I'm sure Dutch probably has his own euphemisms for that. But having been successful like Dutch has been at booking, looking at somebody and coming up with a character for that person, and then figuring out how to push that character and foster it along until it becomes like a household name or successful, which I guess would be the same thing. That's where the great bookers separate themselves from everybody else. Anybody can go, okay, James, let me think here. I'm going to make you a bath separatist, or I'm going to make you a this or a that. Right? That's easy enough. Now, how do we take that and make that character make sense? How do we digest it? Because remember, we got a lot of kids watching. We have adults watching. There's a big span of age groups. The ones that are great at it, the ones that have done it successfully, they know that stuff very, very well. And I would bet last dollar to a dollar that Jim Herd wouldn't have any more idea of how to do that than any fan watching this podcast right now. And that's probably being condescending to the fans because the fans that watch, I doubt that Jim Herd was much of a wrestling aficionado. In my few discussions with him, I don't recall us ever getting deep into the philosophy of character development or anything like that. It was all about money and this, the business side of stuff. But he was ultimately, if you remember me telling the story, I was just going to fly straight home whenever I walked out of WCW in Baton Rouge. And I called Eddie Gilbert from the airport. And Eddie said, don't fly direct to Pittsburgh, fly through Atlanta, spend the night and come see Jim in the morning. Because he was the one that smartened me up to the fact that decisions were being made in the office. And then when it would get out to the field, say Dallas or Pittsburgh or Cincinnati, it would change out there. And then if Jim would ask anything about that when they got back, hey, I thought he was supposed to win or this one was supposed to lose, they would say, oh, well, something happened or they screwed up or whatever. They put the heat on the talent. And so we had these multiple head brain trusts. The brain trust that was in the office that never came out to the field, the brain trust that was in the field, then the booking committee where it was, the circular booking committee where they could all point the guns at each other. And it was just an absolute epic how not to do this. And, it doesn't stand to reason. It's not Jim Cornette's fault that Jim Cornette was looking out for Midnight Express on that booking committee, or that Flair was looking out for his stuff with the Horsemen, or that, each of these little fiefdoms and the rest of everything else just sort of floated around like flotsam and jetsam in the Ethernet around WCW. And I think that probably was the beginning at the end. The WCW had died years before the body hit the floor. All the little witticisms that we use, the lunatics running the asylum, and Jim Herd thinking he's directing something from Atlanta, and then something different's happening out there. Then the heat's being put back on the talent when they come back to Jim Herd. No industry, no business. If you run a hamburger stand, you can run it that way. And yet
or a pizza stand, of course,
or a Pizza Hut. Yeah. Yes, it's which, by the way, I think is when I was a kid, Pizza Huts were ubiquitous, and now they're fairly few and far between compared to what they used to be. I think Jim Herd was actually probably before Kip Fry when he was handing out those huge contracts to everybody. And then you had people like Ole coming back in, and then Bill Watts, who had these really old school thoughts about contracts. And I just was talking about Bill Watts the other day, and when it came up, talking about the guarantee contracts. And I remember Bill saying multiple times, guarantee contracts will be the death of this business. And, within a few years, suddenly everybody was stubbing their toe and couldn't wrestle for 6 weeks. And we've seen so much more since then. The problem was each of these guys had their own different philosophies on the business. Kip Fry was lavishing money out. Then these Oles and Bill Watts came in, and to them, like when they were that age, they weren't making but this much, and so now they're making this much, and they think you should be making that much, like they were back 30 years ago. And it just created this whole atmosphere, oxygen in WCW that just everybody was just waiting to see, okay, like each time the carousel comes back around to this point, like who's in charge today? Okay, here it's going to go around. Who is it today? And the next time it comes around, who is it now? And it was always somebody. I mean, how many times was Vince Russo fired and brought back? Bischoff let go, come back. Then it's Bischoff and Russo together. Then it's Russo. Then it's Bischoff. I mean, it was this just like crazy, just lunatic way of running a company. And you can imagine in a company that's in a business profession that's predicated on creating characters, creating intelligent storylines, and fostering that along. Well, they're all playing Peyton Place back at the office. How much time was being put forward to any kind of the nuancical stuff, the stuff that makes wrestling great, and very little, if any. And so that really, I think, is the epitaph of WCW, and it's a shame because as we talk about Halloween Havoc this week, we'll get into a lot of what I think really separated us from WWE at the time. And instead of augmenting those things that we were great at, they were in this point of trying to somehow like 1 foot here in sports entertainment and 1 foot old school. And again, just how not to do it.
It's funny you mentioned that 1 foot in sports entertainment. This is a couple of things down, but Giant Gonzalez El Gigante debuts around this time as well. Before we get to that, though, I want to mention this because you went to NWA, because it was still the NWA at that point before Ted Turner bought it in 1988. At the time, Dave Meltzer, and this is in late 1989, described the continual fall of WCW and the NWA over the past year and said about Dusty Rhodes' final days in charge of creative. So here's the quote. Virtually all the same mistakes over the fall quarter of 1988, when Dusty Rhodes nearly totally sabotaged the group and left it for dead, are occurring today. What do you think that Dave Meltzer means when he says that Dusty Rhodes was intentionally trying to sabotage the company at the end? Is that the way you remember it in 88?
Right at the time it was getting ready to switch over, we didn't know that until like right beforehand, but you could sense that it was different. Like anytime I travel over, whether it's Canada or Europe or somewhere, as soon as I get off the plane, I can tell it's not America anymore, right? It's all modern, it's all great, but there's something that's different about it. In those last 6, 7, 8 months of the NWA, there was something different. My recollection of Dusty's booking at the time was it had grown tired because everything was, at the time, if you go back and watch the tapes, as soon as the action starts picking up, whether it's a tag team match on a hot tag or the babyface starts making a comeback, just when the action starts to pick up, everybody would stand up and go and return to the entrance. So they knew somebody would be running in. And I had to get clear of a message there. And so at the time, there was a lot of conversation in the dressing rooms about Dusty's hot-shotting it again, right? And at the time, as far as his character went, every time somebody got loosely popular, Dusty would be there with them. Remember, he's out there with the Road Warriors, face painted, Sting face. He's out there with Sting face painting, and he's doing. Each time he would do that, it would seem to us in the dressing room that he was doing that to get himself over alongside of them, but to push himself sort of in front of them. And that was like the criticism of Dusty's booking at that time. And let's face it, like I've talked about before with Paul Heyman, for anybody that's ever done anything creatively, whether you write poetry or you're a writer or, you write music, or you're a wrestler and creating facets to your character and storyline, nobody has a bottomless well of creativity. Creativity can wane and ebb, up and down, but typically once it dries out, once it's bone dry, it's not if you take 6 months off, it'll come back here. It just really never comes back fully. And I think at this time with Dusty's booking, it was showing that his well was getting close to the bottom. I don't remember ever hearing the discussion about sabotage. It just seemed in the dressing room at that time, he was past his time. Like he had some pretty prodigious years, and it was time for somebody else. But the question was at that time, who is that somebody else? Who's that next thing? Because again, in 40 plus years in wrestling, I can probably name 3, 4, possibly 5 if I really dug deep. Guys that I thought that were fantastic at that creativity, and demonstrated for an ample amount of time. They all have their big years, and then either time passes by, the booking no longer makes sense, that style, or for some of them, like wrestling when done well always will try to wrap in current events. And again, I talk about contemporary lens, and wrestling done well always looks through that contemporary lens. And oftentimes, I think with Bill Watts at the end of his booking, you would see him doing stuff they did in the 50s, 60s, or early 70s. Problem was it was mid 80s, and but I don't remember hearing people thinking that Dusty was sabotaging.
Well, let me give you some things that Meltzer says in '89 that was wrong in WCW. Some creative, some not. Constant no-shows, which is obviously not a creative issue. Screwjob finishes, the same wrestlers being pushed, which even back in the day was, I'm sure, was a tale as old as time. Terrible syndicated shows. So apparently, apart from the main one, the syndicated shows were not very good. Poor house show promotion. Gimmicks. This is the ding-dong era, of course. And matches changing with no explanation, which we will actually talk about in part 2 of Halloween Havoc 89 that we're going to be discussing later. Now, some more news. Brian Pillman had recently been stabbed 4 times by a home invader. I had no idea about this. True? Is it true?
Yes. Well, that's the story that we heard at the time, that there had been an intruder, and that was around the time that Brian then started getting guns and things in the house, which would then come into play later when he'd broken his ankle in WWF. and they did the play on the gun stuff. Yeah. If you'd asked me that just cold, I wouldn't have known. But when you said it, I was like, oh, yeah, I do remember hearing that. Yeah. But because Brian, like me, Zank Pillman, and Johnny Ace, we would typically travel together. As I recollect, I remember because we're all, what the hell happened? Oh, it's crazy. And he would say, "Well, I can't talk about it. Can't talk about it." Like there was a case pending or something. And looking back, now that I'm sitting here thinking about it, I wonder because Brian was always pushing that loose cannon thing that quite couldn't nail down. Is he being legit? Is it not legit? But I remember always hearing that had happened, and that's why he was like somebody became like Mr. Gun owner and all of that.
Next up, we'll probably skip past quite a few of these so we can get to the show itself, and if there's any space at the end, we'll lob them back in. Jorge, Giant Gonzalez, after several months of working on house shows, debuts on television as El Gigante, tagging with, of all people, the Junkyard Dog. Now, next up, Shane Douglas recently gets his arm out of a sling after Sid Vicious managed to injure both him and Johnny Ace in the same match. Sid was set. In fact, do I even need to say what happened?
No, I mean, you can. I remember.
Well, apparently Sid was said to have punched Johnny hard in the face and dropped Shane wrong on a slam. Take us back to that's what happened.
Yeah, it wasn't a slam. We were in Troy, New York, which was a huge heel town, right? And as we'll talk about Halloween Havoc, dynamic dudes were just a little bit less than well liked. We went out on the pay-per-view. Corny was out there with us, and they would typically, regardless of who we were working with, would typically want me to stay in the ring the most. And, it was getting tiresome. I was in there, so we decided to get the heat on me, and the crowd starts chanting, "Sid, Sid, Sid." And I remember this was like glaze going over his eyes, like mesmerized by it. And he grabbed me and he throws me out to the floor. But as he throws me out to the floor, as I hit and I go to sit up, like his feet are already on the floor. Now at this time, they didn't allow us, we were allowed ringside, but they fretted on that. They wanted the action in the ring. And now we're both out there, and he reaches down and grabs me, but hard, like yanks my hair and tells me, "I'm throwing you out." Well, we're already on the floor, and I said, "We are out." And he starts throwing me towards the railing. I'm going, no, because we were forbidden to go over that rail. And he was so big and strong as he's throwing me, like in one swoop, like picks me up over his head and throws me straight up in the air. Well, the railing is right below me, and I'm kicking, trying to clear myself either one side or the other. And last second, I pulled my arms in like to brace myself, and my body was sort of turned cockeyed, and I landed right on my elbow on the railing. And he grabs me again. I mean, I just no sooner take this fall, and he grabs me again. Cornette came around and hit him with the racket, and I kicked him like in the leg or something. And I knew my arm was hurt. I didn't know it was broken yet, but I knew it was hurt. And I told Cornette, "I think my arm's broke." And Cornette, "Oh, Jesus Christ!" And he starts yelling stuff at the ref and everything. We finished that match, and then the next night, I know my arm's broken. I'm going to X-ray that night, so I'm out. And instead of putting Danny Spivey out there with Johnny, could have had a halfway decent match. They put Sid out there with Johnny Ace. Well, there's a phrase in wrestling, the curtain sellout, right? Everybody, there's some place on the curtain watching. And he throws it, saying, "Sid, the glaze." He throws Johnny in, hits him with a clothesline, but literally hits him like right here. And you see the big puff of red, and Johnny goes down. Either his teeth are knocked out or his nose is broken, something. So they bring Johnny back and finish the match early, obviously. They come back. We're in Buffalo, New York on this one. And Flair's the booker. He's at the building, right? So he comes over. They put Johnny on this desk. They clear his desk off, and Johnny's like, "Oh, son of a bitch!" He's like, just over showing his broken nose. And he goes, Johnny, calm down. Let me take a look at it." So Johnny starts when he pulls his hands away, and Look at this. It's broken, Johnny. No, Jesus Christ. And here goes, Johnny, it's just a broken nose. He goes, Johnny, oh, sir. But my face is my gimmick. And the whole dressing room just goes, ah! Just starts cracking up. We get Johnny, me, Tom Zink, take him to the hospital. It was dead. It was a Saturday night, I believe. It was the weekend and dead. There's nobody in there. The dog had like rock and roll out in the room. He comes in. He's okay, yeah. And he tells me and Zink, he's turned around doing something. He goes, looks at us. I hold him down, like quietly, right?
Oh,
so God. He comes over to John, and so we start holding him down. He turns around. He gets this long ass needle. And I don't like needles. I'm going like, he takes it. He shoves it up Johnny's nose. And Johnny starts like pushing and flailing and screaming, and it didn't look like fun. But he numbed it up after that and was able to set it and everything. But 2 days, dynamic dudes wiped out. I had never worn a cast like I'm supposed to. I can't. I get claustrophobic. But they were talking in this Halloween Havoc. We're talking about the brace that was on my arm. I hadn't realized in watching it that was post injury. But yeah, so yeah, it took 2 days. The Twin Towers decimated the dynamic dudes. Must have been the delight of the Buffalo crowd and the Troy crowd. It was.
Man, what was it with Sid? Was he just mesmerized by being popular for the first time in his life? Yeah. So he just like got energized like Popeye and spinach and just had to do something.
Yes. Yes, very much. And big, powerful guy like him, big, strong guy like him, could and was dangerous in the ring. But he always, even like back in Continental before that, he's just damn near a 7-foot guy, huge, powerful. And they had him doing the humongous gimmick there. Well, he wanted to do like hip ups and head scissors, and I'm like, dude, like no, like leave that stuff for me. You're the big cousin, right? Cousin Hugo. And there's and if I've told the story, you can stop me. Where he wanted Sika, who was in Continental with Sika and Alan Jackson. The gimmick for Alan Jackson was that he had inherited this money and bought Sika's contract. Dressing rooms are kayfabe at this time, right? So he keeps telling me, I want to do this spot where I, do a flying head scissors on Sika. So I said, please don't call that spot with Sika. Like, just listen to Sika, right? Easy. So he gets Sika back. Now he had the hockey mask on. So he got Sika back in the corner, and I could see the mask going up and down. He's calling something a million miles an hour. I'm going, oh, shit, he's going to do it. So he goes over and he leaves Sika in the corner. And he walks over to Alan Jackson, Jackson had skindle arms like this, right? So he climbs up on the top rope and he drops off and he gives this really like weak little punch. And Sid goes, and the whole building went quiet. They thought he had a heart attack or something. Here, he had called to Sika. Sika was supposed to come up behind him and get down like a schoolboy. Like Sika's going to do that, right? The wild Samoan. And Sika did. As I remembered, Sika started walking over toward him, and he like Yui'd off and went over to the neutral corner and crossed his legs and ended in the corner watching. And we get back to the dressing room, and Sid was madder than hell. And I said, "Would you learn anything, Sid?" I told you, just listen to Sika. And but he was always wanted to do more stuff like that. And you would try till you were blue in the face to explain it. What kind of a character he is and what that means. And he just never, I think, and he was an incredible athlete for as big as he was. But especially at that time, again, we're looking through the current lens, right? If we put ourselves back in '89, big guys didn't do that, and it wasn't, and he couldn't do it like if you were another match with a big guy or whatever. But just to typically throw it in, so you can do it, I think a lot of fans would go like, the hell Sid doing head scissors for? It just would have looked awkward and weird and ill-timed. And anyway, we'll move on.
Do you know what? I mean, I think you're going to be hard-pressed to come up with a better story than that. I really enjoy that as well. I love a Sid story, but they were too corkers then. Right, let's move on. A recent WCW memo goes out demanding toned-down violence and no blood on television. Now, keep in mind, this is all November '89, or around this time. Although pay-per-view and then house shows were not really. Just on TV only, essentially. Pay-per-view had a dispensation. And there was no such restrictions. The plastic bag spot with Terry Funk, strangling Ric Flair, and Scott Steiner's on-camera street mugging segments seem to be the catalyst for this. We'll probably talk about that another day. We've got so much to get through. I'm sorry, everybody. Next is Ricky Steamboat sues WCW/NWA over promoting him and using his image for shows as far in advance as October, despite leaving the promotion in July. A former mental patient slashed 46-year-old Antonio... Oh, I'm sorry, this is on other news now. Slashed Antonio Inoki in the face while he was giving a speech at a concert following his recent foray into politics. He received emergency medical treatment and returned to the concert to assure people he was okay. More news elsewhere from WCW. Bam Bam Bigelow is making a venture into boxing. I hadn't realised that he was interested in, let's just call it shoot fighting, so early on, but did you always know Bam was... all about it. He did an MMA fight years later, when he couldn't really do it, but I mean, a proper tough guy then back in the day.
Yeah, oh yeah, definitely a tough guy. No, Bammer had never spoken about any interest in outside things like that, other than acting, like when he'd done the Trident bubblegum commercial or chewing gum commercial. Excuse me. He seemed so, to me anyway, completely focused on the business. And I think he made his name in bones. He was well known before this, but when he had this WrestleMania match against LT, Lawrence Taylor, that was what put him on that A tier. You can have that good of a match with a guy that's not a wrestler. And in our travels and discussions, I never heard him talking about tough men contests, which is what a lot of that stuff was called back then, boxing, anything other than the acting. He would talk about the acting mostly because of the health insurance. I think he said it was like $50 a month at the time for his family. And, as we were together more after that, from the Triple Threat on, he would often talk about what he was going to do after the business, after being in the ring. And I think at that time is when he started opening up more about the acting, getting involved. I think there was a couple bit parts that he had, and he enjoyed that and was good at it. I was watching an old episode of McMillan and Wife, which you probably never heard of, on one of my Roku channels. And they had, I don't know the guy's name, but this guy was the guy that every TV show back in the 70s had on as a cameo as the heavy bad guy. It was one of those faces. And Bammers, you remember, had that push, right? He could grow his hair out and hide the tattoos and everything, or wear a wig or whatever. But he had that kisser, that scowl that he could really, play out. And because of his size and everything, and now notoriety from wrestling. That was the only thing I ever heard Bammer talk about after the ring, was being involved in acting. I'd never had voiced any opinion about fighting or boxing or any of that.
Next up, Akira Maeda is in the States trying to put together a fight with boxing heavyweight champion of the world, Mike Tyson. A new wrestler makes his way to Memphis, a huge rookie called the Soul Taker, who is... Do you know? No?
Soul Taker? No. I do. Oh, God.
He tagged with The Undertaker in Memphis when he was very young. No. Did someone shout it out back there, or...
No, there's nobody here.
Oh, sorry, I thought someone would shout out. The Godfather. He was the Soul Taker.
Oh, yeah, of course.
We'll talk about Godfather another time. Leah Maivia, Lars Anderson, and Ati Soho are in court, accused of extortion of a wannabe promoter in Hawaii. Which they were found all not guilty somehow. They were accused of some wannabe a B-level promoter wanted to promote in Hawaii, and they demanded a $5,000 tribute. Kind of thing.
Yeah.
FMW debuts led by its founder Atsushi Onita. Joey Morella ends up in a serious car wreck in '89. Sadly, it fortunately wouldn't be his last. Yeah. Barry Windham, who recently re-debuted for the WWF, buggers off again without giving notice and is fired. It's suggested at the time that he had a benign tumour removed, but Barry, I'm pretty sure, told me that he just got sick of it and left. So God knows what happened there.
Barry would do that quite often. He would pop in. There was another time that I want to say in WCW, didn't show up somewhere, said he needed $25,000, needed surgery on his hand, I think, and never showed up after that. Barry, I love Barry, and boy, what an incredible worker. I think that he had, having grown, when I interviewed him myself, having grown up around the business, I think that there was always so many lies being told and stories and things. There was always just like the facade of wrestling. And I think, just for my 2 cents worth, we had spoken specifically about this, but that he had just grown tired of that because he'd been around it his entire life. And like, he would just get to a point where like he might be on his Harley driving to a show and go, zip off, and wouldn't see him for 6 months someplace. But yeah, he at that time had gotten quite a reputation for that. And at one point, I remember like the talk being in the business, like nobody would use him because of that. Like, Barry would always get his foot back in the door because he was so damn good.
I'm trying to think how many times he did it. I don't know if he revealed when I interviewed him that when he was doing the US Express thing with Mike Rotunda, if I'm correct in saying that, he did the same thing there. He just went, I don't know if it was just like the road got the best of me. I had to go. See you later. And then he did it with the Widowmaker. There's like a bit of a respect for him like that, because he's not going to be sort of like beholden to any promoter. It's like, no, dude, when the pressure gets, I'm done. I'm not going to kill myself for anyone's sake. So. Yeah,
that's always been my take on it, and I think the boys sort of had a kind of respect for it. Like, hey, because we'd all loved at the times go, hey, fuck you guys, and be off and done and walk off, and none of us were in a position to. So like, you see something like Barry that you respected do it. It always seemed like in some ways leveling that playing field just a hair. Strike one for the good guys.
Yeah. And the very last bit of news is Koko B. Ware is fired from the WWF after thoroughly kicking the ass of WWF exec Jim Troy, after Troy makes various racially charged statements, allegedly, toward Koko in Brussels, Belgium. The Rockers were also fired and then rehired the next day, although for a completely different reason. Koko B. Ware would be rehired about 6 weeks later. So, onto the pay-per-view itself. How far did you get into it as we record today? Did you watch the whole thing or just the first half?
Yeah, watched to the end.
Oh, you watched to the end? Okay, then, right.
We fast forwarded past like different parts and stuff, but we got the gist of it.
Yeah, I gave some advice for a couple of matches to skip, but I'm going to read some preamble here of the pay-per-view itself. WCW Halloween Havoc 1989, settling the score. October 28th, Civic Center in Philadelphia, PA, 7,300 in attendance, and quite an impressive buy rate of 1.7, indicating around 150,000 buys. The debut for the new pay-per-view concept headlined by the Thunderdome. What is the Thunderdome? You'll find out in part 2, because I didn't quite know what to expect of this, and quite frankly, after all the nonsense they were talking about an electrified cage, nobody expected them to all just forget about it, essentially. Now, so, Elvira had been booked to produce some very good promos to advertise Halloween Havoc in the run-up to it. Watching this, I know you watched it on the WWE Network. I hope you liked library music overdubbing, because there was quite a lot of it on this one. And then Jim Ross and Bob Caudle, well, I'm sure you've got a lot of love for Bob Caudle, everyone does, thrown to Gordon Soley in the back, who's, I've got to say, Gordon Soley's voice when he was doing interviews in the back, it seemed a bit weaker than I'm used to. Is that just to my ear, or was he faltering vocally at this point?
Yeah, he was starting to get a little bit older then, and I think, it was showing. I mean, he was not a young guy at that time, and but just one of those guys. At least for me, having grown up watching him, like to be in the same room or doing an interview with him or whatever, it was like really sort of cool. And I think more at the time, as I'm looking back at it, it was like, okay, his voice is weak, but maybe he's got a cold or whatever. You're not thinking of it like now. You see the spans of time. Because he was one of those guys that for us kids in the dressing room, was like one of the heavyweights. He's like one of the guys, and just always, Gordon was always just cool to be around. All those announcers were, they Lance Russell, Bob Caudle, all those guys. It wasn't like I see today where the announcers are off over here and they're given scripts or points to say or whatever. They would float around with the guys and shoot the shit with the guys, and ask questions and different things. It was a lot more homogenous in the way that they approached their job as announcers. And because of who they were, all of them, it was just sort of like a little bit cool to us, that we're actually standing and working with these guys. But he was, by that end, by that time frame, like nearing the end of his career, his voice was sort of winning, which is, I think, why they kept him off the play-by-play. It was a lot more demanding, and figured that putting him out there and that kind of thing, he still carried that gravitas. Everybody still knew who he was. And now it's sort of just like, giving him his platform in the back, a little bit easier path for him.
It's always an unfair question to ask it, but just play-by-play, forget the colour, forget teams, just as a play-by-play announcer, where does Gordon Soley rank on that list? The greatest?
Certainly top 3, 5, maybe. He was for so many years. Once WTBS, once cable television came in, early mid 80s, like in that 83, 4, 5, 6 in that like range, suddenly we're able to watch the NWA program, Georgia Championship Wrestling programs. And up to then, it was always just, he was a picture in a magazine for me. And suddenly you hear him talking. And to this day, the old timers in the dressing room talk about a vertical souffle. It's not a suplex, it was a souffle. I think something you eat. But just those little witticisms and quips and things that he would have that made Gordon Soley Gordon Soley. For me, it's obviously, I'm sure somebody like Chris would probably say Jim Ross, right? Because when he was of age and coming into wrestling as a fan, for me it was Bill Cardell in Pittsburgh, and then Gordon Soley later, and certainly Jim Ross played in there. My top play-by-play guy ever, probably done with a lot of other people's, Joey Styles. I thought Joey was extraordinary at it because he did it without a play-by-play guy, without a color guy, and did it much. And I don't think he even knew that he was doing it that way, but was doing it much the way that Bob Caudle and Lance Russell and Gordon Soley and those guys would, because he would come in and talk. I remember he and Taz talking about the Taz mission, and they came up with the name Kata Hajime. And, so like Joey was very reminiscent to me as the star in that company of these luminaries of previous generations. And again, because of what it was, the presentation of ECW is so different at that time to what fans had seen from wrestling prior. This was a completely different painting. This had not been seen. And so that Joey was so adept at that. And I don't know if he was knowingly invoking the Soleys and the Caudles and the Russells and all of those guys, but he very much felt like that in the way that he approached it, to me anyway.
Now, Chris Cruz is also in the back. I didn't write this down, but I think that may have been his on-screen debut, or at least pay-per-view debut, but someone correct me if it wasn't. And then he introduces the world's most dangerous ring announcer, David Michael Capetta, who announces the first match, Tom Zenk versus Captain Mike Rotunda, Nick Patrick refereeing. Now, did you watch it?
We watched pieces of it. We watched probably from the comeback, fully from the comeback on. The two things that popped out at me, well, three things. One was you could see already how the audience was being conditioned, right? Rotunda and Tom both were working hard. Neither was being lazy. Everything was semantically sound. But the crowd is very flat. You'd hear the applause here and there, chants maybe a little bit here and there. But you could see, like, well, this ain't Flair, or it ain't the Four Horsemen, or it ain't Dusty. The audience beginning to get that conditioning and waiting. The other thing that stuck out to me was, and if you'd have bet me prior to watching, I probably would have lost the bet. I don't ever remember Mike Rotunda doing a blind cross body block, ever. And he did it pretty well, so, and then the final thing that popped out to me was as they roll through, he does the cross body block, the blind cross body, and they roll through Zenk on top. if you watch the cover, initially on the one count, Tom is on the one shoulder and reaching over, but as the 2 count comes down, he reaches over and covers up the rest of his chest as Rotunda is also pulling him down. So now he's fully covered for a pin. A tiny detail that most people would never catch, but it's those like tiny little things like that, the nuanceable stuff I talk about, that to me somehow just made that just a little bit more, because it's just wrestling, so it's a cover, everyone knows the finish, referee knows the count. Yeah, but it doesn't look right. The visual of it isn't correct. And then one final point, I know it's the last one beyond me. One more point. In watching this match, it struck me the question as to why Tom Zank never did make it, because he had everything. He was damn solid in the ring, certainly had the look, right? Everything was there. All the pieces of the puzzle were there, other than, like, and Chris made a comment about, like, I didn't sleep with the right people or something. Because he was pretty prodigious on the road and had his fun on the road. But again, this is prior to this period, and maybe I'm just naive. Prior to like us coming into the business, it seemed to me that if you were a great worker and you were drawing reaction and getting crowd to come to that building, sooner or later you're going to get pushed. And the saying in the dressing room used to always be, it's about putting asses in the seats, right? If you're doing that, and Zank had every tool to do that, then what was it that kept him from excelling into those top spots? A lot of time it's timing, luck, but it wasn't like Tom was in and out. Like, Tom was there for a fairly significant period of time, and yet somehow, looking back, you look at that guy on the screen and think, what was he lacking? What was he missing? And by my calculus, I could see nothing. I could identify nothing as to why he didn't get that push.
Mike Rotunda. I'm just going to say this as a fan watching of all different iterations of Mike Rotunda. I've got to say I was never a fan. I know he's a bad guy and all that kind of thing, but there's something about him that I can never gravitate to. I can never connect with as a performer. I mean, he's got the size. He's obviously got the pedigree, a very good amateur wrestler, very well regarded into the business. But why do you think that was, as a fan, to me? Was it like a charisma thing that was struggling? Because he never seemed to like break out, into the upper echelons like Tom Zank didn't either, despite the fact that he had a lot of things going for him.
Yeah, again, all those tools were there. I think, and again, this is just my 2 cents worth on it. He never excelled at the promos. And as a heel, that's like one of those cards you have to have in your deck as a heel. It's certainly in that time frame, because you had the Flairs and guys like that before you, the Horsemen. So that was one quiver that he didn't have in his, or one arrow he didn't have in his quiver. But he was always semantically sound. I remember when he was teaming with Steve Williams, and Johnny would get in there, and we'd wrestle him around the loop and everything. And Johnny would occasionally, do something where, like, he would take Steve down, and Steve, of course, is working with him, so he'd do it. But then he would helicopter on him and jump up and come want to tag me, and I was like, my arm would go, yeah, I don't think so. So, you're not going to piss the big guy in the bull off like that and put me in there to take the brunt of it. That was the thing that, to me, was the one piece that Mike was missing. I mean, Mike would tell you he didn't like doing promos, wasn't good at it, was sort of shied away from it. He had that pedigree. My guess, and pure guess, would be that guys like that had that pedigree coming into pro wrestling at that time and prior, which would have been in the time he's coming up and watching wrestling and everything, that he would have assumed that pedigree alone would have been enough to carry him over, like it had been in previous generations. Unfortunately for Mike, we were coming into this period that none of us could have imagined, where wrestling was going to go to the stratosphere, right? And everything televised. The number of people watching on a weekly basis, everything just exploded to places that nobody before us could ever imagined. And suddenly the game had switched. There were new things that were needed, like promos. and the telegenesis, right? We're on TV. This is a TV product. And a lot of those guys, Steamboat hated doing promos, but Steamer knew where those cameras were. And I think Mike would just do his wrestling just around and about, never really focusing, at least in those years when he's first transitioning into heel, finding those. A lot of those guys at that time had that feeling like the camera should find us. We have all these cameras around here, so we're wrestling this way or this way. The camera should get around there to pick it up. And a lot of times in television, especially in a TV match, depending on the time you're given, you've got to play to those cameras because this spot might be so fast. By the time Jackie can run around the ring to get that shot, you're 3 moves ahead. That would be my guess again on those things, because as I was like me with Mike, he just never had that over the top heel charisma. Like, oh shit, it's Mike Rotunda. Everybody respected his work, and Mike is a great guy. But I think that again, how everything changes. The business that he had watched prior and then had this great amateur background at Syracuse now comes into wrestling expecting to apply what he had seen as a kid, and suddenly the game had changed. But that would be my guess too, is the life of promos and the telegenesis of our product.
Tom Zenk gets a quick pin on Mike by reversing a second rope crossbody after getting beaten up the majority of the bouts. Now, we go to Chris Cruz. He interviews main event guest referee Bruno Sammartino. We will save Bruno for next week because we've got a load of Bruno questions, but we'll sort of like lump them all together for next week, next time we do this anyway. And then the next match is a 6-man tag, Midnight Express and Dr. Death Steve Williams with Jim Cornette versus the Samoan SWAT team, Fatu and Samu and Samoan Savage, best known as Tama or Tonga Kid, with the Big Kahuna, Oliver Humperdinck, which he looked just like Lou Albano when he came out there as well, man, I tell you. So we could go any different number of directions with all these 6 guys in here. About the match first, what did you think of it? I mean, it seemed like a lot of fun, and I'll tell you what, Dr. Death Steve Williams, I've not watched him in a while. I forgot what a ball of energy he was.
Yeah, that was the first thing that jumped out at me was, and Moose was commenting on, Steve, most big guys have that girth and everything, and because Steve didn't have that, and when he's in the ring, he's in the ring with guys that are relatively the same size. It's hard to notice on a TV screen just how big and thick he was. I mean, he was just a thick human being and tough. Like you just see, watch his legs, the ripples in his legs as he's moving and running around. 4-time All-American wrestler, 4-time All-American football player. That's a rarity in college sports, especially today. He, at some points, because he had that energy, and he brought that from his football career. Which again, Bill Watts loved, and Jim Ross, if you remember the commentary was always football, football, football. There were times that I think Steve would have been better served to try to pull that energy back a hair, let stuff breathe. But just again, to see him, he was like one of those guys larger than life as the kid that I was in the dressing room. So when I get to watch something like that and seeing him alive and so robust and so Steve Williams, it's sad to think of him gone, because there was just there was a human being there. There was this guy that was, a lot deeper than people would expect, but what a physical specimen he was. And the Samoans. I mean, every time I talk about the Samoans, I say this: in that family, it's in the genes. They all are great wrestlers. They know where to move, how to move around, how to get you over, do all of these things. It's just so second nature to all of them. That was my take on that match in general. What I didn't like about the match is
I quite liked the match. I didn't know you'd have a criticism.
No, I liked it, but Midnight Express did not seem like Midnight Express to me. It was like the babyface turn. Them getting outsmarted instead of them being the ones doing the outsmarting. For me, I always thought when some vicious heel turns babyface, all of a sudden he's weak and he's getting beat up. And what happened to that guy? Like you bring those facets over, And a lot of people that have made those transitions back and forth, the best of them, like if you watch Flair, and I don't like to put him over. He deserves it. He's such a great worker. Whether he was babyface or heel, he was Flair, right? He wasn't suddenly doing something different than he was doing, whether he was on the other side of the fence or not. And that's smart. For me, that was the part in watching it. Like, is there like doing this babyface thing? I see Stan looks almost out of place, and Bobby, I thought did a great job selling. But it was so not Midnight Express to me. It'd been years since I'd seen them in that babyface role. Because let's face it, I mean, as a heel tag team, they're par nonchalants, right? I mean, they were like pretty much the cream of the cream, and like suddenly now they're babyfaces, so they're somehow not as smart or quick or shady or shifty or whatever euphemism you want to throw to them. But no, I thought it was a good match, especially for a 6-man tag and 6 people being such different styles.
We'll leave the Samoan side. I wanted to pick up a couple of things that you said with Midnight Express, especially. Actually, do you think they were uncomfortable in their new role? Because I can see you nodding, but I'll follow this up with this. Is that Stan Lane, and this is Stan Lane we're talking about, messes up 2 things at the end. I think he almost goes for like a super kick, and then he second guesses himself. And then, as I've written it, I can't remember what the finish is, and it says, and then Stan gets knocked into Jim Cornette, who's on the apron and gets pinned. There was something else after the kick as well, where it didn't seem fluid. The neck breaker, yes. And I was just like, man, I don't remember ever seeing that from a Midnight Express match. Do you think it was just like their unfamiliarity in that role they were in?
Yeah. I mean, obviously in that setup, right? You got the Samoans, big, tough guys that can fly around. Being in that face role, you're going to have to be in a sell position at some point to get this match over. You can't get to a hot tag. You can't get to a comeback without that in a 6-man. I thought the same thing the first time I saw him mess the swinging neck breaker. I was like, ooh, it's something you don't normally see them doing. Like you said with the super kick thing, it seemed awkward, and I'm sure that's got to be it. I mean, at this point, they had been prodigious heels, the top of that heel tag team division for how many years, and suddenly they're doing things that they wouldn't otherwise do. But yeah, that was without question that would come into play because again, you're thinking as a babyface now instead of as a heel. And to me, what always made the Midnight Express so phenomenal as heels, aside from Bobby's work rate and their tag, the chemistry between them. And Corny, of course, was the fact that no matter how hard you tried, they were always like willing to do one more thing to get you. There was just that little part that I thought was missing in that babyface role.
I'm going to go back to Dr. Death and then we'll move on. Dr. Death, did you ever wrestle him in UWF or WCW? How was he?
Yeah, WCW. He was one of those guys. He would definitely work with you because he could go in there and pulverize if he wanted to. He was one of those guys, much like Haku. Like if you give him an arm bar or a headlock or something, you could tell just by the feel of his body that he could just flick you off if he wanted to, or just pick you up and squeeze you to death. Steve, I never saw Steve go to the ring and half-ass it. He was always like really going. And again, I think at times because of the style of character that he was, and because of the heft and the thickness, that there were times that if he would have slowed it down and planned on, say, like a bear hug or something, that it would have given him a lot more longevity in the ring. And I think it would have done a lot more to sell that particular point. But remember where he came from in UWF, Bill Watts was always, and Jim Ross were always pushing that football thing, football. And so I think he thought the guy that won, those national championships and stuff had to be that guy. And, it's a shame because I think if Steve had been under the right auspice, and I'm not suggesting that Bill wasn't the right thing or later Dusty, but if he'd had the right teachers at the right time to teach him those things, where as a big guy, you don't have to be going 900 miles an hour the whole time. That's for smaller guys like us. but just to let that settle in. And there was another point, another match, and we'll get to that in a second, or next week's episode, where the Road Warriors are facing off with the Towers, right, between Spivey and Sid, where at the very end of the match, after this thing starts to break down, there's that face-off between Animal and Sid for about a half a second, and they start going at it. I looked at Chris, I went, oh my God, if they had held that for 5, 6, 7 seconds, you'd have felt the building just go, it would have been like the volcano rising, just let it breathe for just a second. And neither of them were at that level, so it's just those little things that you pick out and, can cherry pick. But yeah, it's Steve Williams was, and I think later there was this black mark on his career because of what happened with Billy Gunn in the Tough Guy contest, right?
Bart.
Well, first
Bart
of all, or Bart rather. Yeah, first of all, Bart's a big tough guy, right? But Steve, let's face it, you got a couple of tough guys in there. It's going to be whoever gets that lucky shot in someplace. And I thought that was sort of unfair to Steve that suddenly all this shine that had been on him suddenly just washed away because of that one incident. Steve was a good guy, intense. I saw him one time at a bar called the Windmill in Columbus, Ohio. Me, him, Barry, Brad Armstrong, we drove out to this place. As I recall, it was at the end of a long straight road off of 70. And it was miles out in the middle of no place. And we go in, the place is packed. And of course, as we go in, people start recognizing, not me, I was just a kid, but they recognize Barry. And of course, they recognize Steve and Brad. These two big guys come up. Turns out later they were football players for Ohio State Buckeyes. And there was the bar. Steve is at the bar getting drinks, and they come up and start talking to him. And me and Barry and Brad are, 8, 10 feet away. And you hear these two guys over the music. It was really loud. And oh, Steve Williams, 8-time All-American, blah, 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 blah. And Steve's nodding along with them. And one of them says to him something just one question, why'd you go into that fake shit? And Steve's demeanor, there came the snorting, bull out, the toro. And the one walked away like he was going to the bathroom or something, but from where we're standing, it's we're watching the panorama. So Steve's now talking to the one guy, and the other guy, who I guess acted like he was going to the bathroom or something, walked about 10, 15 feet away, and he's going, sizing Steve up. I went to step forward, to say something to Steve, and Barry goes, no, just watch. And this kid takes a run and hammers Steve. Almost knocked him down. He dropped his beer, took a couple back steps, and out came that snort. And when I tell you he beat the hell out of these two guys, it would be like Andre beating the hell out of two kids. He manhandled these two. And bartender told me, go get the car. Barry told me, go get the car. And as I was leaving, Brad came running up behind me. He said, Barry said, pull the car up behind the bar. So the bartender had told them to go out, that the cops had been called. So they told us, he told them, who later told us I'm driving, said, I pulled with the headlights off, pulled to the back corner of the building, and we can see all these cop cars flying down the road, sirens going, right? As they pull in, we pulled out and drove away, and that was the end of it. But yeah, Steve was legit tough guy. Yeah.
There you go. It's funny because I was actually talking to Bradshaw not too long ago, who was also in the Brawl for All, and he was talking about Bart Gunn as well, and he said he was a tough dude. I also said, Jack Doan was the referee, and I said, can you believe that the referee, who's not really a referee, for boxing especially, would just send you back out there when you could tell that you weren't all home? And Bradshaw said, I told him in the back, if I was standing, send me back out. So I was like, do you know what? In fairness to you, you were going to lose, but at least you were going to go out on your shield. But yeah, that Brawl for All did no one any favours, it turned out, in the end.
The thing with Bart and Billy both, you see them as a tag team, right? Before I never met them, I'm thinking, okay, they're like Marty and Sean size, big guys, but you meet them. I mean, they're huge. I mean, they're both big men, like monster guys. Like huge guys. So yeah, both those guys, I'm sure, could handle themselves. And Bart, that after that, but it was well known before that. The business. Bart's a tough guy, but Bart's take care of himself. So I'm glad to hear Bradshaw concurred on that.
Yeah. A couple of quick things, and we're going to get to the main event of this podcast, which you know what it is, let me tell you. Gordon Soley interviews Gary Hart and Terry Funk. Funk says he's going to invent a new dance, the 10,000-volt electrified boogie, or something like that, anyway. Which didn't happen because the cage wasn't electrified, but that'll come on the next episode. We talk about this. The next match is one that I also told you to skip, essentially, because it was Cuban Assassin Fidel Sierra versus Wildfire Tommy Rich, who was returning to WCW, or the NWA, I should say. Even on the commentary, Jim Ross says that Rich disappeared into obscurity. Obscurity being Memphis. In the mid-1980s, he doesn't say Memphis, but he just says obscurity, in the mid-1980s. So was this a shot at Memphis, or is this what is this in aid of, to basically say Tommy Rich just disappeared off the face of the planet for years?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the one thing about Tommy Rich was, if you remember back, they had, when I think Kurt Hennig was there in Memphis, they had this cage match where, as I recall, that was the first time I'd seen on TV as a kid a crowd lose its mind. They had the cage match, and then afterwards you see something come up and they've been hiding under the ring, and they get in and they shave it. I mean, the fans were like trying to climb and get in. I mean, the place just went nuts. Tommy, when you go back and you watch that first iteration, again, the world was different. But boy, he came in, he was that first modern babyface, that babyface that could take that ass whooping, get busted open, all of a sudden, man, he started making that fiery comeback. He was the template that most babyfaces after fed off of. And so, like, for me, I'm always willing to give the credit where the credit's due for those guys. I was a mimicker. I mimicked the wrestlers that came before me. Guys like Sabu, Tommy Rich then, Rey Mysterio Jr. later. These are transitional figures. These are people that once they're in the business, once they expose their wares, the business is different afterwards. I was a wrestler, like the guys that wrestled before me, and there have been wrestlers after me. But those guys they took the business someplace different than before it. Tommy was not a big guy. Before that, the baby faces that got pushed were the bigger guys, your bruiser looking guys, the pushes like the Bam Bam pushes. Suddenly here comes this, comparatively smaller guy, gets his ass whooped, boy, he won't say die. And that changed babyfaced him after that. So I give a lot of credit to that. This is the time, I think, with Jim Ross's comment, where we had these camps sprout up, right? You still had Portland, you still had Continental, you still had Memphis, obviously. But by now, the WWF had become this growing behemoth, and NWA was on the cusp of transforming into WCW and then into WCW. So you had these smaller territories are now sort of pulling in, still being fairly successful. But this was the time where we're warring with this company, and these other guys are just, wannabes or pretenders or whatever. That would be my guess as to why there was that shot taken. And it could have also been something as easy as some kind of inside joke between him and Lawler or somebody else at Memphis at that time. But by now, wrestling is becoming much more of a two-game race, right? It's a two-man race at this point.
I also noted that, I don't know if it was a shot at Memphis, but Ric Flair had recently made shoot comments on a radio station burying Jerry Lawler as nothing but a joke world champion at the time. So I don't know if it's just something against Memphis. But sticking with Tommy, could Rich... Right, so, I mean, I've interviewed Tommy, and I think he'd say... I don't know if he'd say it or admit it, but basically he likes to drink. That's got in his way of his career. We're not telling any tales out of school there. He'll say the same thing. If Rich had been on the more straight and narrow, could he have been bigger? Because obviously, he's huge in his early to mid-20s, and then when he comes to more national companies like WCW or later ECW, it's in reduced roles, even though he's still a fairly young man. Could he have been bigger, or was he always destined to be like a regional hit? Could he ever been like a national main eventer?
Absolutely. Assuming certain things all being equal. If he had, gotten into the gym, worked on his bike. Remember, he was just the young, skinny kid, which is, I think, part of what made that character, the selling and all of that. By now, he's ensconced. That generation of fans that he played to were part of. They hadn't left. They were part of what made this massive group because more people were coming in. So absolutely, if Tommy had not gone the route of the drinking and the things that you said that he would tell you, absolutely could have been. And I think in many ways, probably could have been had like his run as in the ring and then transitioned into the backstage area. Baby faces at that time, I can tell you, as a baby face at that time, it was sort of just like fly by the seat of your pants. You were learning stuff from different wrestlers, different styles every night, but nobody was coming to you and saying, okay, as a baby face, this is what a baby face is, and this is what fire is, and this is what a comeback and selling is. There was nobody doing that. And so you look back and each of us had our own sort of way of doing it. And it was almost like you found it haphazardly. You sort of stumbled into it if you got it right. Very rare that anybody in those dressing rooms was saying, okay, let me educate you. And I don't mean to say that, like, in the Flair sense, they were using it as a weapon, but like I've mentioned this before, like if you went to the ring with Pez Wada, you're going to work, say, like a 3-month program with Pez. Pez is going to go into that and thinking, okay, I'm going to teach him this, this, and this. And just those 3 things. And he might occasionally throw something else in there, whatever, but that's his goal is to get these 3 things into you. He's not worried about getting you up to the main event or even semi-main or even half card, the second half card position. His job is to teach you those few things, whatever the number is. And each person beyond that is, going to be adding their 2 cents worth to it. I think Tommy, because he was such the epitome or personification, right, of a baby face, and what baby faces had become by that time, would have been invaluable to have as a coach in the back for us kids that were coming in at that time. Yeah, he most certainly could have.
Now, Tommy Rich, unsurprisingly, because Cuban Assassin was just brought in to lose pretty quickly, it seemed like, I hate to say this, the fans were chanting boring throughout this match. Tommy had been away for a while, and the fans weren't buying him, apparently, at this point. Now, he wins with, of all things, a Luthez press. Now, we go to the back. Gordon Soley is interviewing Michael Hayes and Jimmy Jam Garvin. He's got, okay, I've actually written this down. And I believe, do you know what? I'm going to save this for the next episode, and I hate to say that because we just don't... No, actually, do you know what? I'm going to bring it up. Jimmy Jam Garvin at this point, Jim Cornette, according to Jim Cornette, was absolutely on the gas at this point, and he was trying to get as big as he possibly could do, and was almost trying to work like a road warrior style kind of thing at this point in his career. So, do you remember this point of the new Freebirds and those coming in, and also Michael Hayes, but Jimmy Jam Garvin basically completely trying to change the way he works to have like a more Smash Mouth style in a company that has Doom and the Steiners and the Road Warriors and Sid.
Yeah. I can't say what one of Jimmy's machinations. My guess would be probably, getting a little bit older and figured, rather than doing a lot of the other stuff, because, and I won't get into the match too much, but he has a sequence of a spot with Johnny where you see him, going back to that old Jimmy Garvin style. My recollection of that time frame was that it's hard to say what came first, the chicken or the egg. The Philadelphia crowd's reaction to us was pretty notable. And at some point, you can't. It's a lot easier to swim downstream than up. But they were almost playing to that, and as heels, that based on that. Let the crowd continue to boo us. That's going to be what that is. But they stopped being who they're supposed to be and started playing almost like the rules had been reversed. which I think brought it down. There was also at this time this, we're in the immediate aftermath of what had been the Freebirds, a pretty prodigious run. So I think the fans they love Jimmy Garvin, and the Philadelphia fans, they always love the heels. Also love the Freebirds, but now we're seeing this new version of it. As I recollect,
I do apologise for it. Do you think the Philly crowd really understood the Freebirds, the original Freebirds, and what they were comparing them to? Because the Freebirds never made it up to Philly, did they?
No, but again, we're at this time now that wrestling has been much like I was in Pittsburgh. I was able to catch the Freebirds, and with cable and everything. And the Freebirds were, again, pretty impactful stable of wrestlers that were pretty ubiquitously known in and around wrestling. I think it helped the fact that it was in Philadelphia against the Dynamic Dudes. Like Chris said, isn't it funny that like 4 or 5 years later, one of the top heels in the industry is going to be one of these guys getting booed as a face. But they almost played to that. Like if you see play times when they're almost playing babyface. My recollections of that match were Johnny exploded afterwards in the dressing room because as we were like calling our stuff, they were like audibling and saying, "No, do this." And I've talked about that before, like with Sean and stuff. When you're in a match trying to call a match, the action's moving. So your brain is already thinking like 3-4 moves ahead. And so you're calling to the stuff to get you there. And then somebody goes, "No, this instead." No, now your brain goes, "Oh, back up a second. No, backdrop," and then back forward again. And so it becomes this real herky-jerky fighting each other instead of working with each other to get to the destination of where you're trying to get the match. It was noteworthy to me that Jimmy, I commented to Moose, I said, "Man, look how big Jimmy is." And I hadn't remembered that prior, but then you said it now, looking back, that would be my guess. Jimmy's getting on a little bit now, right? And Michael too. And you got two 20-year-old kids standing over here full of piss and vinegar it's a lot easier to go out there and do this than arm drags or dip backdrops or whatever. But once the match settled into itself, even though there were all these other things going on in the backstory, you could still see that there was still a semblance of the match being pushed together there. So like to me, it looked almost like Jimmy and Michael were having fun. Oh my God, we're finally getting popped and cheered, almost like with the Sid on the opposite way. Getting caught up in that as opposed to focusing on what the match should have been. But again, at some point, you can't, nothing worse to me than when a heel goes out in front of a crowd and the crowd's completely quiet, and the heel yells, "Shut up!" If it gets any quieter, like you'd have to be in a library, right? It just looks silly and out of place. And at some point, they would have had to just go and play with it, with the reaction they're getting, because it's so not what the company is trying to portray. But why would you, if somebody's cheering you and you've been as a heel and all these years you've been telling everybody how great you are and everything else, now they're cheering you, why would you be pissed at that? Why would you fight back against it? Only if it's fake wrestling, but we're supposed to be getting booed, so we'll do this. It just, to me, it was, I think you said Moose had texted you. I was like chuckling to myself because I remembered being there. I used to get, like, as we were landing in places like Philadelphia or Buffalo, New York, Troy, New York, places upstate New York, all those Northeast cities are heel towns, big time heel towns. And so one thing they weren't going to like was these smarmy, pussy looking baby faces, right? Just this poor booking by WCW to put that match on there. If they were expecting for Johnny and I to get over and them to get booed, that probably wasn't the place to do it. They always say you know your audience, and that clearly was WCW again rearing its head. They didn't know their audience.
You said that Michael Hayes was getting on in years. He just turned 30. a few months earlier. So
that's Michael Hayes' years.
I suppose. Well, at some point, he's got to be pickled and preserved for quite a long time. Do you know what? Just because we're on Michael Hayes, and I really want to know about this, is I've actually written here, because you mentioned, the beginning of the match was getting a bit clunky. There's something I wrote here, was the first proper spot in the match is that you throw a clothesline for Hayes to duck, but instead he leaps into it like a salmon going upstream. And I thought there's a total disconnect of what was going to happen then. And then he takes a weird net breaker as well. Michael Hayes is a worker. Forget about the charisma and the interviews and everything like that. It's always been said that he was the charisma and the other guys surrounding him was the workers. But Michael Hayes as a worker to work with, what did you make of him? Middling?
Not this. Just there. To me, even in this match, you can see like Jimmy is the shine, right? Michael has all that charisma and he can do all of that. And it's like that in a lot of teams. I mean, look at Midnight Express. Stan Lane will be the first to tell you Bobby's the workhorse, right? Stan's going to get in and do his dancing and smile at the girls and do all of that. But Bobby was the engine in that team. So this isn't a slam of Michael. Michael was great because Michael was great on the stick. Michael was great because he had Gary Gordy and Buddy Roberts with him, right? And now Jimmy. And Jimmy was, known as a fairly decent worker. So, but there's, again, we talked about this with Mike a few seconds ago, Rotunda. The business is changing. The business is different than the business had been then. And I think that Michael was smart enough to identify that. There needs to be somebody with that charisma and the gift of gab and everything. So I think it did play together well as far as the two of those guys together. I noticed the first thing you did. Remember, we had talked about this before with the Razor Ramon thing. If I want you to duck two clotheslines, both those clotheslines are going to come with the same arm. And when he comes off to the second one, you can see like there's like some kind of like you said, like jumping into it or whatever. And then I think right after that, you can see me trying to again call something to him, and it goes awry. I think at the time, and again, like it's I don't want to sound like I'm slamming guys. I'm trying to explain it in my own head. Prior to this time period, the heels would typically call the match, right? And so Johnny and I would typically be, if it was 5 to 10 years earlier, would be listening to them and throwing our stuff in. But by now, it's becoming like sort of this mishmash, like catch as catch can. You call your stuff, we'll call our stuff. Once those transitions have been made, once we're out of the shine and into the heat, we're listening to you. When we're going to the comeback, you listen to us. And I think it was very representative in that match as I'm looking at it. And again, remembering in the dressing room back, Johnny throwing things and kicking garbage cans and stuff over, really pissed about that lack of chemistry in there. It was like, I remember Johnny screaming, "It's not supposed to be us and them. It's supposed to be us, all 4 of us." Him screaming that in the dressing room with some pretty color expletives in between, colorful expletives. But, again, this is when the business is in transition. And look, one thing I can tell you for sure, certain is at this point, looking back, when you have a crowd that solidly one way, and again, any of us could have told you before that show, that's going to be a heel town. To just presume that you can go into that town because you're going to be televising it or pay-per-viewing it to other audiences. It's, for an audience in the South that are more babyface towns, watching the babyface team get booed like that, deeply booed, probably not the best look. I mean, as a company, now you're pushing to pull against yourself. Okay, we want these guys over his faces, but they're going to get the shit booed out of them in this town. Poor booking.
Now, let's go to the let's just see what I've written, quite frankly. I wrote this about a week ago, so bear with me, everybody. I can't quite remember the match. So it's a rematch of a tag title tournament final from June. This is, by the way, Fabulous Freebirds versus Dynamic Dudes with Jim Cornette. Some overdub music, of course. You walk to the ring carrying the skateboards, and then you stick a hat on a kid and a thumbs up to the wrong camera. You both turn around going like that, and like that, which I thought was great. I really enjoyed that bit. Bad Street, or whatever their song was overdubbed. So I don't know, maybe the WWE doesn't own the rights to the Freebird song that they made for it. Jim Ross claims that Michael Hayes was the first person to use rock and roll music as an entrance song. Somehow I'm dubious of that because there was a lot of entrance music happening beforehand, but he's probably the most famous for doing it. Jim Ross also says that both you and Johnny have degrees. So I always like that Jim Ross brings a little bit of the personal in with that kind of thing. Yours was in education, wasn't it, your degree?
Yes. Yeah. Well, actually, my degree was in political science. This was 89. So, yes, I would have just gotten my education certificate right in 89. It was 3 of 89. I got my education certificate. Went back and took those courses. And the reason that was always so well known in WCW and NWA was we would take the G1, the private plane. And as we'd be flying back from wherever we were at that night, flying back to Charlotte, I'd be in the very back seat. They had like captain seats, couches and stuff. It wasn't like a typical plane. And I'd have the light on and have my books and be highlighting my books. Everybody else is getting drunk on the plane, and I'm over there like bookworm Eddie. It's but they had made a big point to talk about that because you hear Jim Ross's call, and it was Deft call where he says, the business prior, two different generations. These guys came into the business as teenagers. These guys got their degrees and are now coming into the business. But there's a lot of more oddities than that between me and Johnny. It's sort of like the Kennedy and Lincoln assassinations, right? Johnny and I both grew up in towns called New Brighton. He was New Brighton, Minnesota. I was New Brighton, Pennsylvania. He had started in the business and gotten his degree. When I say started in the business, he started training and playing in the business with no intention of, much like I did, to not get into wrestling, just sort of stay in shape while I was at college. He did the same thing because of his brother. We later then both get into the business. So there were a lot of commonalities like that seemed strange. He had used his degree before he came into the business full time. I had been in the business full time and then left to use my degree. So there were these Kennedy and Lincoln assassination comparisons, that would come up between me and Johnny. I was telling Moose earlier, the thing that as I look back, the one thing that jumped out at me, as you can see, even at that young age, I'm in pretty darn good shape. Our contract said that we had to be tan, bleach blonde, and have abs. So I would continuously get yelled at by the office and by the bookers and by everybody about Johnny. And I'm thinking, well, I ain't Johnny's dad. I'm getting up and going to the gym every morning. It's not my job to hold his hand. Go yell at him if you want to. But just those little things that you watch back to that and reminisce, because once you hear the crowd going like they are, like I said, I was just laughing my ass off earlier because I remember back then I used to get nauseous going into towns like that. No matter how, it didn't matter how hard you worked, it didn't matter how good your spots were, didn't matter any of that. You were going to get chewed up and spit out. And then once you said, okay, well, that's what it's going to be, just go with it. A lot easier.
Did your contract also stipulate that you and Johnny had to look super gay in those neon shorts?
No, they came up with those things. The things that you look back and you remember as you're watching it. What looked really strange is I'm so used now to the fringe on my boots. Watching, those moving around in those boots that they had made. They had those boots made, oddly enough. They had never taken measurements. They had Clifford Macias, the great bootmaker, long since passed away. Best bootmaker in the business. If you look closely, we have sharkskin toes and heels and eyelets up the sides. Sharkskin is almost impervious. So patent leather will always wear out and crack and break off. Sharkskin, it'll scuff, but you'll never wear it out. And that was how later when I would make the franchise boots with the fringe, I would always be with Clifford Macias. But those boots luckily fit me because I just got lucky, I guess. But if you look at Johnny's when they pull the laces up, there was no leather and leather touch together because they just made these boots blind for us without any measurements.
Where did the rest of the outfits come from? Because we've got neon short shorts and the caps and everything like that. Was it just the style of the time, or was it?
Well, the neon,
Who
late 80s, everything was neon, right? Neon became the big color and go-to for everything. And, they were just because of us being together at that time is when they started putting those things together. I'm trying to remember who used to make our tights. I think Johnny maybe had somebody making them. And if you remember, there were times, I didn't even notice on this when we fast forward past it, where we would pull there were tearaway jersey or shorts that we'd wear over on the way to the ring. The problem was that frickin' Velcro. There were times when it would grab like it was bolted together, and so like going out, you'd have to like just barely touch the Velcro or it wouldn't rip off that easy. And it just became like this whole, like this side would rip right off, this side wouldn't or whatever. It just was so ill-conceived in the way it's played out. The interesting thing about the neon colors was that his name was Casey something. He was the head of merchandising. And, Johnny, again, was always thinking business-wise. And so Johnny said, we got to keep him close, like keep him tight, staying good with him. So anytime we'd be at the bar, we'd always buy him drinks, take him out with us, that kind of thing. And that one year, the summer that Johnny and I were together, they had me, Johnny, Tom, Pillman, Brad Armstrong. They were doing the Great American Bash tour, like 75, 6 days long. The 4 or 5 of us we were to be at the building at 1:00 every day because they would do like a meet and greet earlier that day when they would sell tickets and stuff. So people coming through, they were selling the merchandise, of course, before you'd come through. And everything they put out of us sold because all the kids wanted neon stuff at that time. So they had hats, T-shirts, bandanas, sunglasses, bracelets, tearaway jerseys or shorts. They had like a ton of dynamic dude stuff out. And every day there's pieces of this coming through that we're signing. So the contract said a third of every dollar, a third went to me, a third went to Johnny, a third went to WCW. And so every day we're looking at these like just thousands of dollars of stuff coming through every single day. And I kept waiting for the merchandise check. Well, I was on the road at the time. My mom was getting my checks. And months go by. And she said, no, just the one check, just the one check. And finally I called home like 4 or 5 months later. And in my head, I'm thinking like, this is going to be worth like 30, 40, 50 grand for each of us, right? There's been a shitload of stuff come through. And I called home, and my mom said, hey, you got 2 checks, one green and one yellow. I said, open the yellow one. So she opens up and she goes, I said, that's the merchandise. That's what I've been waiting for. And I'm talking about it. And she goes, well, it's not very good. I said, well, what's not very good? She goes, $9.98. I went, $998? Mm-hmm. She goes, no, $9.98. I about had a stroke. And so point taken about like the young green kid doesn't know like how, the angles that they get played in wrestling.
I think I've heard you talk before. You probably talked with me before how the Dynamic Dudes got. I don't even know really how you and Johnny sort of got paired up originally, but the character of the Dynamic Dudes, was this correct me if I'm wrong, a Jim Herd focus group kind of thing?
Yes.
Tell me.
Yeah, so Jim Herd, again, in his infinite piece of wisdom, had commissioned a study in California with the thought being whatever starts in California works eastward, which is generally correct. Most fads start there and then work our way. The top 10 words or whatever, words or phrases, and the top 2 were dynamic and dude, or dude and dynamic, which I don't know which one was 1 or which one was 2. And in his infinite wisdom, if I take the first 2 words and put them together, that's going to make a great gimmick. Again, when I talk about the nuances, right? Mm-hmm. And Johnny and I had debuted with, Johnny had been the sheep herder's flag bearer, and we had gotten along pretty well. I think that was apparent to the powers that be that we enjoyed being around each other, traveling together and everything. And we had debuted on the Music City Showdown, which was the pay-per-view in Nashville that Terry Funk pile drove Flair through the table. And we had debuted on that pay-per-view as Johnny and Shane, the next generation or the new generation. And to this day, I can't remember which it was. And the next morning, we're in the hotel van to be taken to the airport. Eddie Gilbert is sitting in the front seat, and Johnny and I are in the second bench. And he goes, well, did you hear your new name? And my thinking, again, young and dumb as I was, I'm thinking, well, we already debuted. We're on a pay-per-view last night. Can't change our name now. And he said, told us about Jim Hurt commissioning this study and came up with the name Dynamic Dudes. And I said, okay, I start laughing, right? Sure, Eddie. And Eddie had a real droll sense of humor. Eddie, one of these. And I could tell by his face, I stopped laughing. I went, please tell me you're fucking ripping. I said, that's the shits. That night we were in Bristol, Tennessee. Flair, I told you, was the booker. So I see Flair. And I said, hey, I got to talk to you about this. This is the shits. And he agreed with it. I think so too. I said, please get it changed. No, and I can do, nothing I can do. And of course, he stepped in and said, hey, this is a crappy idea. Because the way it was portended to us when they first gave the idea of the gimmick to us was that the Rock and Roll Express by now is getting old. There've been these different incarnations of babyface teams, and this was the idea of what the next babyface tag team would look like. And so the next or new generation was what they settled on. And when it went to that, everything else sort of that they had played out to us, once that name came in, didn't make sense. They wanted us to be that, white meat stuff. And if you look back at Rock and Roll Express, excuse me, Ricky was phenomenal at selling. Ricky was also great at firing up. When Ricky had to throw that fire, he could do all that. And somehow that got lost in that translation and fell to the wayside. Eddie Gilbert, rest his soul, had the idea of turning us heels. Like, give us like a 6-month run as this Dynamic Dudes thing, and then turn us stone cold heel. And of course, that never happened. So it was a shame. I would like to see what Eddie would have done with that. And ironic, because when I've told you the story before about Jim Ross, after Ricky and I were together, saying, if anybody ever told you you're a stone cold fucking heel? And I said, yeah, Eddie Gilbert. And, so we'd have to wait till later before I would start to get that chance. But, it was, as soon as they tagged Dynamic Dudes onto it, it was dead in the water. It really was, like, even like the girls that had been coming with us, and we'd done a lot of tapings prior to that pay-per-view. And then, of course, the pay-per-view. The girls were coming. The guys were getting involved with it, getting behind it a little bit. But as soon as they clamped that Dynamic Dudes on it, just like went. It was untold to everybody.
One more thing to end this on. Of course, you are being managed by Jim Cornette. When did you find out that Jim Cornette was going to start managing you? And was it always... I've got several questions here. When did you find out Jim Cornette was going to start managing you? Did you always know that the story was that he was going to turn on you? And were you excited to have Jim as a manager?
Well, we first learned of it I think that was the idea once they put the name on us and they could see that this wasn't getting over the way that they expected. I think they thought it was a way to rekindle Jimmy, like refuel him, put some more gas in his tank. It was portrayed to us that Jim was going to be coming with us. And so that was why the way we're playing it out, Midnight now turning babyface, us being with Jim, that was that they were going to turn on Jim, and then we would be with Jim and fight back against them. That was the way it was originally portrayed to us. Where we learned that was not going to happen was on those runs up in New York, where I would get my arm broken and Johnny would be, somehow it came out there. I forget if Jim told us, Flair told us, somebody brought it up. In hindsight, it seems almost insane that they would have taken him off of Midnight Express. I don't know if they were waiting to see if maybe something worked, if something clicked with us. But as you're watching it, it's almost like the way Jimmy's playing. It's almost as if we've replaced Stan and Bobby, and he's still playing the same gimmick pretty much, and same type of character. Just a minor change from this side of the fence to that side of the fence. So yeah, it was laid out there again, like with what we mentioned in last week's episode about Bill Goldberg. Surprise, promoter didn't live up to what they were promising. That was something else. And again, I don't know. I've never heard any story as to whether he legitimately was planning on coming with us and then something changed, or that was the plan all along. I don't know.
Just to end on this, when Jim, and we'll probably do its own episode on the show. I can't remember if it's a pay-per-view or it may be a clash, actually, that the big turn happens. Did you realise that when Jim Cornette turned on you and realigned with the Midnight Express, the original plan was obviously for the Midnight Express and Cornette to be the bad guys going forward, and then when Jim Cornette turned on you guys, he ended up getting cheered vociferously. Were you expecting that?
No. Well, again, wherever that happened, it would have depended on the town, because I was always cognizant of what towns were heel towns, what towns were babyface towns. It just seemed to me that like the way it had been portrayed to us and laid out to us, it now made us look sort of silly and stupid, like that we trusted in this guy and we followed along. But moving forward from that, we assumed that this was going to give us a prolonged run with Midnight, and I was all for that. Anytime you'd be in the ring with those guys, it was phenomenal night off. But we did have a bit of a run with him. I can't recall how long it was, but it wasn't like Rock and Roll Express versus Midnight Express type buildup. It was just, here it is, and there it was.
And the town that Cornette turned on you was Troy, New York.
Barely
2 weeks later. So, I mean, if you're in Troy, New York, then you probably knew what you were going to get. Freebirds defeat Dynamic Dudes via pinfall. Johnny gets cut off from the ring. Shane gets the hot tag, attempts a double back body drop on Garvin, only for Michael Hayes to trip Johnny, and Garvin spins around to get the pin on Shane for the clean win. And there we go. That's the first half of Halloween Havoc 89. Did you want to say anything about the finish there, or...?
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, there were two things that stood out to me into the match. The one was the heat. Most of the heat they had on Johnny was just like kicking him, keeping out of the ring. And the other was on that finish line. As soon as it happened, I remembered it. And I said, you know why they did it that way, not the other way, right? Mm-hmm. And he said, no, why is it? Because they didn't trust Johnny to be able to take that fall and pull him into position. So they wanted that typically would end up like that. That was my recollection of being with the dudes, was that no matter who we were working with, they would come to me in the dressing room and say, you stay in the ring, which wasn't fair to me. I wanted to be able to get out and breathe and take a breather too. And then when like a timing spot or something like that would come up, the eyeballs would go, okay, let's go to Shane for that. I think Johnny was, at least at this early period like this, he was bought in and he was working hard. Something about Johnny's work, it's always like a little herky-jerky, because he didn't come in as a wrestler. Like, it was like a different pathway in. But he was working really hard. We get to the buildings, we get out of the ring and that kind of thing. It was like he was really working hard to learn the craft. And at around this time, like when this swerve comes, it's sort of like, Bill Goldberg saying what he said about Vince, or how many times I've said things over the years. It was like the realization went on, like, oh, this isn't quite what I thought it was going to be. And, he would start slacking off a bit then, like not quite as putting much time into it as he had been. And probably smart in doing that, because why do that if it's going to be a throwaway anyway?
On that, we're going to shut down this podcast. Thank you very much, everybody, for watching. We will be... Oh, I should have said this on the last episode, but normally we're out on Tuesdays from this will probably already come out, but I'm going to move this to Wednesdays now, purely because Dutch Mantel's second podcast is out on a Tuesday, so it makes no sense to have all the podcasts come out on the same day, essentially. So you'll probably know this by now because it came out on Wednesday for you. But thank you very much for watching. We'll be back next Wednesday with, I think, a fan question episode. Then the week after, that'll be Halloween Havoc Part 2. So look out for that. Thank you very much for watching, and Shane closes out.
Hey, good to see you again. Happy New Year to everybody one more time. See you next week's episode. Appreciate you sitting under the franchise's learning tree at Franchise University.